Welcome to Digging into the Future. I'm Robert Pepper with PTC, and our guest today is Joseph Alm, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Security at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for having me, Pepper. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so economic security, DHS, could just maybe explain a little bit about what that is and where that fits?
Yeah, we start with the, what would you do here question. What would you say you do here? So economic security is, basically fitting two pieces, right? There's the national security side, which you naturally think of when you're engaging with DHS, which is protection of data, it's protection of infrastructure from physical, logical attacks. But there's the economic side that's also a critical part of that, which this role particularly came about a couple of years ago, I want to say 8 years ago, but came about essentially with the recognition that national security is ultimately downstream from economic dominance. And so you can't, if you parse those separately, sometimes you miss very important things where prosperity is part of the wise strategy that should encompass kind of a lot of these questions. And so the national security piece is a piece of it, but economic growth is a piece of it. And so it's kind of marrying those two together to build coherent long-term strategy. For the United States, and specifically at DHS, it's for critical infrastructure. And so thinking about how do we build the things that we need and how do we secure the things that we need in a way that's going to allow us and our citizens to be prosperous. And so fitting into that is a lot of other things. There's specific kind of components of that. There's, Team Telecom, which is doing reviews of basically cable, and their telecom transfers from a national security standpoint. There is CFIUS, which is doing reviews of incoming kind of foreign investment, which the administration recognizes is valuable and critical to this broader build out. But also you have to review it to make sure there's not malign influence. There's not some sort of tie there that's going to be a poison pill, so you're always watching for that kind of stuff. There's also under me the Supply Chain Resilience Center, which basically analyzes supply chains for vulnerabilities and trying to identify places that we can strengthen the supply chains for critical infrastructure. Because as we saw kind of in COVID, all these things can be vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to black swan events. They're vulnerable to emergencies. And you can't just assume that you set up a system and it's going to stay that same system and it's going to work. You have to actually look deeply into where are the sole source components, where are the adversary components, where do we have to think wisely as a country, as a government, about improving the kind of durability, the resilience of those supply chains. And so that's another piece kind of in my portfolio. And then within that broader portfolio, we also engage on a lot of industrial policy. There's drone stuff. There's other things that kind of come through in the interagency. And so those are the main tranches. We also, interestingly, do Ice Pact, so Arctic strategy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of things.
Yeah, that's very cool. But, this is digging into the future. So what you're saying is you have to think forward. It's not just about status quo or looking backward.
Oh, absolutely. And that is something that whenever I'm engaging on this stuff, I think pretty deeply about is we're not looking at what incident just happened 6 months ago and how do we fix that supply chain challenge. Like mostly we're thinking about what is going to happen. What happens in a situation with multi-polarity, with different great power players trying to move in different ways. How does that affect the supply chains? And you can dig in on this in numerous ways. It could be refining spaces when you're dealing with are we going to have sufficient lithium stores since that's perishable? How do you analyze that? How do you build that out into a coherent domestic cell production? It's that kind of thing that we're thinking about often. And of course, they're informed by current challenges, but it's also informed by our analysis of current vulnerabilities, which is really a forward-looking kind of analysis.
Yeah, and so going forward, AI, everybody's talking about AI. So, what did the administration think about AI? I mean, why is it important? And I know that these are issues that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the president has been, very forward-leaning on this with the AI action plan and with identifying AI as a national priority. And the reason he identifies it as a national priority is helpful to understand. It's a geopolitical asset that enables us to achieve multiples on productivity that are possibly beyond what really anyone's been imagining before. And so, as such, it's a place that you have to win as a nation. Otherwise, it's a huge vulnerability. Like if your people, if your knowledge workers had this capacity to use AI agents and to build networks of AI agents interfacing with each other and accomplishing more than any individuals can possibly do by themselves, you're just going to be so much more valuable and so much more powerful. And there's also a dynamic there which is about the kind of trust and reliability of the AI ecosystem, which is, I'm confident, and the administration is confident, that the build out there from our businesses and our companies is going to be focused on doing it in a way that produces prosperity, and it's also not going to be fundamentally nefarious. Like, we are going to be trying to produce AI that is fundamentally truth-seeking and that fundamentally advances humanity forward. You can't just assume that if you allow other players to win in this kind of grand, challenging conflict. The other thing that I'd also bring this back to, because I think a lot of people will miss this because they focus on kind of the tech side of it, divorced from the consequences of the technology, which is we always think about this in the context of the United States and really why the president was elected. The president was very clear about there was an era that initiated a decline. It was NAFTA, pushed a bunch of opportunity overseas and impacted Americans deeply and in a deeply bad way. And I understand the nuances of why that happened. Like, it's a cheap labor play, it's a regulatory arbitrage play. Like, I understand it. I don't agree with it, but I understand why it happened. But what we're doing now is an intentional reshoring, bringing these things back. And part of that is this geopolitical level of understanding you actually have huge consequences to not having the industrial capacity in terms of what the nation can do and where it can go and how, it's not just prosperous, but how independent you can be. Can you just say, we're not going to engage with that set of problems on the other side of the world. We're not going to spend infinity money on it. Well, actually, if all your supply chains are integrated everywhere and everything's going to collapse if you don't, well, you actually take away a lot of optionality. So that's a piece of it. But it's also the piece of, if we make great prosperity here, our people will be better off. And that's what fundamentally motivates, me and others throughout the admin. I entered here because I saw these kind of decade after decade shrinking of opportunities for most people. And I would do anything to try to shift that so that my kids, and it's not just my kids directly, it's generationally Americans, so that the hope and opportunity and trajectory is upward again. And AI provides an opportunity for that. It also provides danger, right? If it's not harnessed well and if that prosperity doesn't help us go on an upward trajectory, well, then we continue. And that's a thing that we always are laser focused on, trying to figure out how to make sure that this is a deep positive. The last thing I'll say is, we're fixing all these supply chain challenges all over the place, right? Dealing with places where we have gaps or domestic industry challenges. But part of the geopolitical calculus is you have to also look at the things you're good at. America is really good at AI. We're really good at software, and we're great at driving innovation. Like, our people are the best in the world at that. And that's a place where you have to have a dual strategy of fixing your problems, playing to your strengths. And AI is one of our strengths. So, that's part of the administration's unlocking of value there.
And so how do you, over what period of time, right, you're talking about reshoring, you're talking about all of the complexity, there's the energy components and being able to scale for that. And how do you think about that also in terms of the resilience that's needed, whether it's from data centers or the networks connecting them, or the development of the foundational models, the inference and all of that? How does all of that, do you see that play, and how do all of these, the complexity of all the pieces come together? And how can you, what are the dials that you have that you can turn, right, to actually get the outcome that you just described?
Absolutely. So I like the phrase, how do you eat an elephant? one bite at a time. And so in terms of approaching this, you have the first set of layers of actions to do and kind of dials to turn, which is providing the clear, credible signals of direction. And the president did that with tariffs. We recently did that with the FCC covered list drone determination, right? Which is, we're going to stop allowing foreign drones and foreign drone components on a go-forward basis over a period of time. There's a lot of other, dynamics where we're, moving kind of the dials to make very clear to industry, like, we are serious. We're building everything, here. We're going to reinvigorate the industrial capacity. So the first part is the signal. Give the clear signal. It has to be credible. You have to make sure that everyone understands it. And to businesses' credit, I think they understand it. I think they've gotten that signal. They're like, yeah, it looks like you guys are serious. Time to start going. So there's been a lot of moves there, and that's been positive. The next layer after that is an implementation phase, and it's basically this working closely hand in hand with business to figure out, what do you actually need? What do you need on timelines? So there's a capital deployment question. There's a timeline for kind of build-outs of factories, for build-outs of data centers. Like, we can come to understandings of what all those timelines are and should be. And part of how you get to that is through a two-way dialogue with industry. And it's useful because industry has this broad range of people, all of whom are brilliant, and they'll come to you and they'll give you conflicting information. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong, but you get to kind of figure out amongst there a policy that's likely to work, a place. It's not always a middle ground. Sometimes you push them hard, sometimes you give them a little more time. But you get to kind of parse that from the insights that they give. And then it's not just a one-time process, right? You do that on the front end, have these dialogues where it says, okay, how long do you need to do these data center deployments? Oh, it's a year? Okay, great, we're gonna give you a year, right? Then you do cycles where you're doing touch points again at 6 months, at a year, and you get to check in on what the progress is like.
So what you're describing really is more of a partnership with the private sector. I mean, the people who write the checks and build the stuff, right?
Yep.
You know this because you came from tech. I mean, you're a techie, basically.
Yep.
So what is it that you are looking for from industry, the private sector, in terms of, are there gaps in knowledge? I mean, who do you want to find out from more than what you already know? And how do you then integrate that into the planning process, right? And the policy process, right? In terms of the feedback loop that you described. And then, how can the private sector, right, collaborate better in a way that it's mutually beneficial? Because what I see is huge alignment between the private sector and what you just described. How do you make it work?
So yeah, totally agree with that alignment. One of the phrases I use here is the Indiana Jones idle switch, and I use this in the context of trade barriers because that's one of the components in like the trade and economic security piece that we do. But it's basically, you can drop all these trade barriers, and then there's a gap to industrial policy. And optimally, what you do is you have the trade barriers and you have the conversation with industry that's figuring out, hey guys, you need 12 months, you need 14 months for this capital deployment to lead to the particular thing that we need here. Okay, let's make sure you do that. And then at 12 months, 14 months, you drop the trade barriers. And then you actually accomplish all the benefits of the industrial policy without any of the downsides. And so, we're starting to use some strategies that are a little bit more like that in terms of trying to get to the next level of just execution and speed. And I think we're getting a lot of success there. So to your other question, though, of how can we do better? Like, how can industry engage with us kind of in a better way, and who are we looking for? So we're looking for, I don't want to say everyone because that's a cop-out, but I'll say an amalgamation of basically it's the financiers, right? Because they're seeing what makes sense and doesn't make sense from a capital standpoint. And we understand we need to make sure that it makes sense. So that's a piece of it. You need to see the executives because they're seeing what the barriers in business process operation, is on the ground to accomplishing the different goals. And then I actually love seeing the engineers because I think that's been something that has been just drastically underappreciated within America, is that the people who can construct the systems to build things are more important than ever. I saw this. You mentioned the tech background. I saw this at Tesla. I was there for 4 years. I ran all their IP litigation, supply chain litigation, a bunch of other things, and I saw engineers just doing incredible things all the time. In COVID, most of the OEMs had shutdowns. We didn't. We were able to keep production going, and it's because of the adaptability that was unlocked by essentially a relentless focus on making sure to get everything out of the way of the engineers. It's like, hey guys, here's the vision. Let's build this, right? That's the vision. Follow that vision. Do it. But then and also there's not going to be anything in your way, and that's part of the energy that we're trying to bring here is understanding like the president has made clear we're going to build everything in America. We're going to win on these fronts. Also, you guys in business are encountering the barriers to making that happen. We want to know that. I want to know that more than anything else. Come to me and tell me, where are those barriers so that I can help break them, so that I can help get you guys through and get you guys forward. Because at the end of the day, it's easy to see that like, oh, in government, you call it public service, and it is public service, that's great. But what people forget is that the business world is also doing a public service. If they execute at the absolute top of what they're doing, if they accomplish what they should be doing, great wealth flows from that. Yeah. Great power flows from that to the United States. And that is a national asset. And one of the greatest things that we actually as Americans do better than anyone else is this capital deployment in the best ways to accomplish kind of amazing things. Anyway, that was a long answer.
No, but that's exactly, that goes back to, I think of, unless the people who write the checks have to have the incentives to write the checks, all right? And that's where the innovation comes from, right? And all too often, there's delay or uncertainty. And some of the work that you've been doing, for example, and pushing on the approvals on part of your Team Telecom role, right, has actually been trying to take some of those, uncertainties away. I love it that when you were PTC DC, one of the lines I keep quoting is, the regulatory approval process for submarine cable shouldn't take longer than building the cable.
100%.
Right? And this is one of the things that you've actually helped to do in streamlining that process, because the companies want to make the investments, right? But, if it's going to take too long or the process is uncertain, they want to know, tell me what I need to do, right? Let me do it, and then I'm going to invest, and we're going to build this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's a frame of reference that I try to use very broadly. It's just like, guys, building the physical things is harder than pushing paper. Every time, all the time. So why is it that pushing paper takes longer? And I've really thought about this, and there are answers. The answer is that there's a power asymmetry, which is when you're building stuff, you compete it out, right? You're going to have the people who are incentivized to do it as quickly as possible and to do it as cheaply as possible. And if they just sat around and didn't do anything and told you they need more time, you probably would fire them, right? Yeah. So, okay, there's a pressure there that keeps that from becoming some slow and efficient quasi-Soviet system. At the same time, that pressure is often not on the regulatory apparatus. And so, and the escalatory path with the regulatory apparatus is often so binary and so extreme that if it's just a matter of time, like the natural flow is let it go. Well, okay, then you get to 2.5 years of approvals, and what the heck are we doing? And so then thinking about how do you keep that from happening? How do you start bringing the apparatus so that it fits into what basically everyone has to concede makes sense? Like, yes, it shouldn't take longer than building the thing. And part of that is place a distinct realignment in understanding of priorities, which is the builders have priority. What they are doing is harder, and we need to fundamentally respect it. It's not that you defer in ways that would be bad for security. Yeah. You've got to do your job. You've got to maintain the important standards that the regulatory apparatus can help you maintain. Those are key. But it's approaching it with a certain version of humility, which is basically that, yeah, okay, you get to do knowledge work. Understand that that's not actually the fancier or better thing. The better thing is the building. They're the ones that we are trying to enable. So that's the first piece. The second piece is then you have to bring an element of enforcement on that function, which is basically like, hey, if you're sitting around not doing things, you're fired, right? Like that, and you really only need to do that like a little bit, and then everyone gets it, and now the incentives are aligned, and great, that solves it. But sadly, in government, that hasn't been around. Like that basic pressure hasn't been around, and I don't want to seem like some villain here, but like at Tesla, right, in 4 years. One of the dynamics that I always was very comfortable with is just like, yeah, Elon might fire you. Like, okay, that's fine. It's part of the game. But the difference was it was a high accountability, high responsibility environment. And that's another thing that we're trying to get government to reflect. There are a lot of people, a lot of fantastic public servants, on my team, and I appreciate them. I appreciate the work they do, and they're smart. They're doing great stuff. It's trying to get them into this space of high accountability, high responsibility, where they can take ownership and do good things, and ultimately achieve far more and have more value in kind of the work that they're doing.
And so, taking ownership and being accountable is like, that's how industry works, right? And I think getting that mindset, right, and being able to do that and achieve that is actually making a difference, and we can see it, right, in some of the work that you're doing. This has been absolutely terrific, right? And I can't thank you enough for being here on Digging into the Future, because it actually is about the future. And just looking forward to continuing to work together and hearing all the great things that you're doing. So
absolutely. Let me close with one thing on digging into the future and thinking about it. A lot of times when I'm having these dialogues, people engage with, this kind of idealization of the 90s of like, oh, we had won. It was the end of history. Everything was great. Also, we still mostly had our industrial capacity. Man, and now we're in this a different era. It's a different time. And young generations, every time I talk to them, they feel this, like they are having a hard time. Yeah. And I try to articulate that everywhere. It's like, guys, you don't understand. Like the pressures are rough. It's real. But at the same time, I am so glad to be in this decade and the decade coming up, because these are decades that are going to fundamentally define the trajectory of civilization, because we're building all of these engines of production. We're building the things that will unlock new prosperity for society, and we're also deciding the kind of people we're going to be. Are we going to be people who engage with frontiers, who engage with hard things, who do all of this hard stuff? If we can set ourselves on the right trajectory, humanity can go to the stars. We can do incredible things. Yeah. If we don't do that, it's a different trajectory, and it's a very dark trajectory. And the great thing in all of that is the high responsibility. In the 90s, you do all this stuff, but you're not fundamentally changing trajectories. Now you're fundamentally changing trajectories. So I'll close in kind of a peak nerdy way with a Lord of the Rings reference, which is, when I think it was Frodo or Sam who was talking to Gandalf, and like, I wish I hadn't lived in those times, in these times. And Gandalf says, well, so do I, so does everyone who lives in those times, but it's not for us to decide. What's for us to decide is, what do we do with the time that we've been given? We've been given an incredibly important time where AI can shape the future, and it can shape it in an incredibly positive way. We need to be focused on making sure that happens.
That's great. That's a great positive message. So again, I can't thank you enough, and thank you very much for being on Digging into the Future here at PTC.
Thank you.